Thank you very much for joining our 12th Health Security Dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. My name is Hiromi Murakami of Global Health Innovation Policy Program, facilitating this dialogue series. We're so honored to welcome a distinguished guest today from Canada, Professor Yves Tiberghien of University of British Columbia. Yves just published his new book titled The East Asian COVID-19 Paradox, and I was so excited to hear his view today. We greatly appreciate that you're taking time for us today. Thank you. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Murakami-sensei. I want to also thank Kurokawa-sensei for hosting me today. It's a great honor. It's actually the first book talk I'm giving. Be followed by others soon, but this is the very first, and it's really fitting that it's in Tokyo. So minasan konnichiwa. I also want, of course, to thank GRIPS and the Global Health Security Dialogue. I'm taking this chance. I saw some old friends on the list of guests, so I'm greeting them, and I'm happy to make new friends. Additionally, it's customary for us here in Canada and at UBC to always start our talks with a land acknowledgement to recognize the indigenous people who lived here before and who never ceded this land. So I'm acknowledging here that I'm working here and learning on the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam people, and I thank them. And then I also want to add that I'm speaking very humbly here because many of you are health specialists and you will know more than me on the health reality, especially here in Japan. And so I'm speaking here as a comparative political scientist, and based on what I could observe, from my isolation during the pandemic. And I look forward to learning from all of you in the discussion and in future exchanges. I'd love to be in touch with many of you. So thank you in advance, and please be not too mad at my mistakes when I make mistakes. We should also add that writing on the pandemic, it's difficult because it's been a moving target. We're not done with it, and the numbers keep changing. My book went to press in April, was published in August. And since then, Delta came. So of course, Delta is not in the book and has changed many things. So I'll do a section here on this talk on Delta because it did impact the outcomes. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right, is it good? It's working? Okay, great. So moving forward, I hope it moved. So this is the book. Did it move forward, Murakami-san? Yeah, okay, good. Sometimes it doesn't. So this is the little book. It's not a huge one. And so a couple cartoons. This has been quite a challenge because governments after governments have been trying all kinds of things. Sometimes they defeat COVID and then COVID pops up again, right? And it waves after waves, and in a way, the pecking orders and the rankings of good practices change over time, showing how complicated this is. This has been a big impact for humanity. It's a big shock from a health perspective, but also global governance and even human perspective, right? Or mental perspective. So there are really three puzzles that I'm looking at. The first one is, why did a global pandemic of relatively limited mortality compared to the Spanish flu or even the Asian flu of 1957, Hong Kong flu of 1968, the mortality rate here is smaller. Why did it trigger the greatest simultaneous lockdown that humanity has ever experienced? The deepest short-term economic recession since the Great Depression, almost 100 years ago, and the most dangerous geopolitical confrontation since, again, the Great Depression. Why did all this happen, right, at this global level? In turn, why did East Asian and Oceanian countries, for example, Australia and New Zealand, but as well as some Pacific islands, on average, perform better than the rest of the world, at least in 2020? 2021, during the summer with Delta, there are big changes. And some of the high performers of 2020 in East Asia, like Vietnam or Malaysia or Thailand, have faced great hardships this past summer. And then finally, why did East Asia and Oceania manage to deepen cooperation in 2020 despite global tensions that were triggered by the pandemic? Today in this talk, I will give a bit of context on question 1 and 3 in the early part, and then I'll focus more on the second part for the rest of this talk. So the key arguments I'll make today and that come out of my book are the following. First, COVID-19 was not just a global health crisis, as Murakami Sensei mentioned. It has generated a global crisis that also involved economy, society, the global order itself, and geopolitics. It has had so many multi-level interacting factors, has generated great stress and fissures in the global order. Second, this was partly due to the timing of the crisis, because it happened in the midst of a very difficult US-China situation. And you have the existing dominant power in the system and the rising second power in the system that were unable to talk to each other. And that was just before the pandemic. And so as a result of those tensions that were predating the pandemic, there was a complete collapse of global coordination and global governance. That made the crisis much worse. And the additional veto of the US under President Trump, but not anymore under Biden, on global cooperation and global institutions has paralyzed the global response for the first year. Third, at the national level, I argue in the book that 2 factors were essential to explain which countries performed better, at least in 2020. The first one is institutional capacity. And I will get quite precise about it, what I mean. And it's below the level of just the healthcare system. We thought before that countries with a powerful healthcare systems like the US or the UK and a democracy would normally be the best performing countries. It turns out they were not. And so it's another level of institutional preparedness and that capacity to act fast in a coordinated fashion that was important. The second factor I emphasize in my book is social resilience and basically trust in a society. That was very, very important, as well as social acceptance of good practices. The final major argument in the book is at the regional level, the combination of existing informal networks that were in part Japan-led before the pandemic, right? Through the WHO, the head of WHO for Asia is Japanese, through the ADB, through JICA and other institutions, as well as the logic of strategic reinforcements in the face of shared uncertainties, played a role in maintaining or deepening cooperation in the region. And that include the ending of RCEP, the negotiation of RCEP that finished in November. So that was extremely astonishing, right? To have great tensions at the global level and in many regions, a great sense of crisis, great criticism among countries, and yet 15 economies in Asia, including China, including many democracies, signed RCEP in the midst of this. So a very interesting timing. So this is some of the key points. So just to refresh all of us, this is the data today. The official, of course, it's undercounted as we know. This is Johns Hopkins data. We have had so far 233 million official COVID cases, almost 5 million official deaths. The real deaths are certainly higher. And you see all the waves. That's the global data. You see the up and down of all those waves. And now we are in the receding 3rd global wave, or maybe 4th if you count this little one here, or 5th if you count this little one. This is the table that everyone is watching every day, right? The ranking of the top 17 countries in this case, still topped by the US, that so far has had 709,000 deaths and almost 44 million cases, followed by India in terms of cases, but Brazil in terms of deaths. UK is very high here, Russia, Turkey, France, etc. And Japan is not in that list, it's much lower. And by region, initially it was primarily a Europe, North America crisis. Well, at the very beginning it was China, then it was Europe, North America, South America. And then this year we had an increase, especially in South Asia, including India, and then Southeast Asia. So Asian cases came big. So it's been around the world. However, Africa has remained, less touched by the crisis, even though, again, there must be lots of undercounting. So here is what I plan to do in the next half hour. First, say a few more things about the global context, just to put everything in perspective, because this is unusual. This is unlike Ebola. This is unlike the global financial crisis. This is the first recent crisis in the post-Cold War era where we had a failing global response at the global architectural level. And so much more burden fell on the national and regional levels. Then I'll talk about comparative national outcomes with COVID, present data on outcomes. Third, I will move to causal factors. Of course, this is moving targets. This is just preliminary factors. It's not a full scientific analysis of all, with a massive regression. This is more based on correlation and some case studies. Then a few words on Delta, a few words on vaccines, and there's an interesting set of puzzles here in East Asia, and then a conclusion. So this is the menu for today. And I really look forward to your comments, feedback, and further exchanges through email. Normally, I come back every year to Japan, but as you know, Japan is still closed, so probably not until 2022. So big picture, COVID started as a serious pandemic in China first in December 2019 and January, then moved to East Asia, and then globally after March. And it led to simultaneous containment measures, including border closures and lockdowns. We had never seen border closures happening to that extent globally since, almost since World War II, right? So this is, and maybe it's even more than World War II to some extent. So this was exceptional in terms of the range of actions that were taken at the global level. By March 2020, the health measures in turn triggered the greatest economic shock to the global system since the 1930s. Some top economists, like the former chief economist to the IMF, said this was the first time that humanity had a coordinated shutdown of almost a third of the economy, of the global economy. In the end, the data is between 20 and 30%, but this is the first time we had a coordinated voluntary shutdown of a big section of the global economy. So in turn, that triggered a massive social crisis, including rising inequalities, a great impact on women, migrants, and on vulnerable groups. So in the end, health decisions completely interact with economic decisions, social decisions, mental health decisions, global decision, and security decisions. It's all interactive, and that was a new phenomenon. So that's the sort of shock we had. In the US, we had minus 35%, and unemployment went up 11 million people suddenly in the US by early summer 2020. Humanity became quarantined. And in terms of impact on the GDP, in the end, it was on a monthly basis, it became minus 20%, but we see where the shock was the biggest, particularly Europe, North America, Asia. It was pretty much everywhere across the board. Boom, it all happened in March, April. Those are the final data. In the end, there was quite some difference in the economic impact. The world output went down 3.5%, advanced economy minus 5%, emerging minus 2%. China managed to be plus 2.3%. Those are the IMF World Economic Outlook data. But otherwise, pretty much across the board, it was deep negative. India minus 8%. Euro area minus 7%, and Japan minus 5%, UK minus 10%. So those are all the impact of the health measures that were taken and the collapse of trade. In turn, there were massive responses because the shock was so great. There was an exceptional unleashing of money by the central banks. So in this case, it's the Fed, the ECB, and BOJ. And there was a sudden explosion of bond purchases. The BOJ was already doing quite a bit, but the share of debt held by all those central banks has gone up and up. So basically, we have taken more risk globally as a result of that pandemic. We also have increased debt. Without looking at all the details, the debt shock over 2 years, 2020, 2021, is an increase in debt of about 25% for the advanced economies over 2 years. Japan is about 30%, US 30%. So it's a huge increase in debt that's bigger than in 2008, 2009. This is all the result of those health measures, right, and the shock of the pandemic. So it's become this moment of great consideration for humanity. How do we manage all the interconnections we have, the interdependence? What will be broken by the crisis in the long term? Can we pick up everything while it left, or will we have long-term damage? It's too early to assess, but we can see that there is some long-term damage. And then we saw different range of tensions. Trade sort of had a big hit. It triggered efforts to change supply chains and reshore them to reduce risks. Effort to decouple from China increased in many parts of the world. We saw more fragmentation of the internet. However, we still see support for globalization still high outside the US. A global digital economy still booming. We saw Japan, EU, and Africa continue support through free trade agreements and some recoupling of Asia continuing. So we have signals going in different directions as a result of this pandemic. What is known is that global governance really misperformed. The G7 did not meet this year in 2020, had no meeting. It was chaired by the US, and President Trump didn't manage to find a formula to get the other members, and he canceled it. The G20 met, but had very difficult agreements, and it was very limited. NATO was full of tensions. There was great tension at the UN, great tension in WTO. There was a candidate vetoed an issue by the US and then later solved by Biden. What worked partially was, below the top leadership level, the institutions themselves, the IMF, World Bank, regional development banks, they continued their work, while the top leaders, the top shareholders were not seeing eye to eye. What triggered this, in a way, misfunctioning of global governance was, number one, the assault by President Trump on global institutions. He didn't believe in global governance, didn't believe in global cooperation, but his veto on many things and pulled out of WHO, for example. Second, the tensions between US and China. Those are two separate factors, and both of them together had a dramatic effect. So clearly the US is critical to the global system. If the US is not interested in WHO or WTO or G20 or G7, those institutions fail, essentially. It's very hard to function without the US. And if the two major shareholders, US and China, have a dispute, it's also very, very hard to have coordination. And it triggers cascade effects. So that's a key story behind what happened in 2020. So I made those tables evaluating global governance on health, economic, financial stabilization, trade, politics, and what did not work, anything from G20, WTO management, UN Security Council, G7, no US-China summit like we used to have, SNED dialogue, China-India conflict added to another dimension here. And then what did work was an interesting coalition around COVAX. In Africa, the CDC Joint Purchase Platform was interesting, and the AU COVID-19 Response Fund. So Africa was innovative. There was central bank coordination below the leadership level. RCEP was interesting. The EU-China Agreement on Investment was, a development of significance, but then later collapsed in May with the sanctions, the exchange of sanctions on each other. So this is a sort of evaluation of global governance. In addition, this fog of uncertainty created much disorder and greater geopolitical risk. There were more security tensions. US-China tensions exploded on many, many fronts. But in addition, Zoom and meetings that are digital don't work as well for diplomacy. There's something about human nature, right? We're unable to fully make compromise, to reach our best potential, to cooperate without eating together, without drinking together, without having corridor discussions. And so for diplomacy, this was a disaster. So in that sense, there's a technical dimension here. Social media made things worse, including digital conflict. There was massive misperceptions, echo chambers. strong assertions of moral rights, etc., without the ability to listen to the other side. So that's attention. China became unhinged. Feeling attacked, it unleashed this wolf warrior diplomacy, which then created a lot of damage and backlash. The US was also unhinged with intense ideological conflict, intense attack on global institutions, and culminating in the end in a crisis of democracy with January 6th, right? Which was very scary for other democracies to watch. China-India border added to this, Turkey's adventurism and further conflicts. So there was all these conflicts bubbling up, taking advantage in a way of the tensions, right, that were happening. I want to add a bit of psychology and mental health here. In times of uncertainty, various societies and their leaders requires focal points for their actions. And usually they use narratives for those focal points. And in times of crisis, we tend to fall back to domestic stories, domestic narratives, domestic memories, experiences. So every country was remembering some past events and reading current events through those past events. So in China, they read the event through the Boxer revolts and the 8-country invasion and 8-country agreements of 1900. There was in the calendar cycle, the Chinese calendar cycle, 2020 is the same cycle as 1900. So the lesson was, don't let anybody bully us. We have to push back, etc. But they were reading current events through historical narratives, and every country was doing things like that, right? In the U.S., they were reading the story through a Cold War narrative, or the need to stand up to non-democratic regimes, etc. And so there was less space to really sit together and listen to each other and then try to solve problems. We have a pandemic, it's a common enemy. Can we at least solve that first, right? It was more difficult. And so it created lots of tit for tat and flight or fight behavior. And so there's a lot of research in psychology or behavioral economics about the impact of narratives and cascade effect. I like the work by Akerlof and Schiller, but many other, Kahneman and etc. Regionalism picked up some of the slack, especially in Asia, EU, Africa. Very interesting convergence between AIIB and ADB and the World Bank cooperating. I will leave the rest here for questions, but there's a section in the book on this. The pandemic governance itself proved to be vulnerable. We discovered, again, that we have weak global governance institutions. The WHO lacked a rapid reaction force, did not have consensus in its committee initially, in this governing committee. That's why they were slow to call the pandemic. Even to call the emergency took until late January. They couldn't do it around January 20 or 22 because there was deadlock in the committee. The US withdrawal from the WHO made things worse. And then there was great competition over vaccine. And initially COVAX took off without the US or Russia, which was a problem. WHO funding is too small and is too tied to donors and all kinds of donors that attach their own conditions. This is data that was published by the Financial Times, but it comes from WHO. So clearly, we have to beef up the WHO, both in terms of capacity, funding, and reactivity. Lots of great work has been published about this. For example, Osterholm and Olshaker with a very interesting book about this before the pandemic already. We know we are going to face two types of growing pandemic risks. One is the flu risks, and the flu remains the most dangerous epidemic based on many books and many research here. And it's all connected to industrial pigs and chickens. So wherever we have pigs and chickens in industrial farms, we may well have a new flu virus. And those conditions are present in many countries, including the US, where H1N1 originated in 2009. And of course, the Spanish flu in Kansas in the 1918, but also China, probably some European cases, probably India, probably all fast-growing large countries with growing middle classes who want to eat meat, right? So we have that risk. Second, we have the coronaviruses, and they're connected to the loss of biodiversity as we encroach into forest and all this. So this is why we need a whole a concept of world health, of One Health. So whenever we encroach into the territories, typically of bats, we are more likely to get in touch with some of the virus they carry, either directly or through some of the other animals that like mongoose or camel for MERS or snakes, etc. For COVID, we don't know yet the story. We know that data has not been forthcoming yet from China. Hopefully, when the tensions come down, we will be able to have more information. But hopefully we'll find what is the intermediary species or whatever happened. So now national outcomes. Here is very interesting. I made a table, so sorry for the orange part. This is in the book. This is as of February 2021, so basically the first year of COVID. I have 3 columns. The cases with high mortality, above 700 per million, medium mortality, less than 700, more than 61, and low mortality. And I grouped countries, I selected countries from each region, representative countries, and even some states for the US and provinces for Canada. And I just record here as of February 6th, the cumulative mortality per million residents. So I use mortality because it's less volatile than cases. Cases extremely volatile. Also, I used, this is from our world in data from Oxford, but basically it's Johns Hopkins data. We know that in some cases it's under-evaluated. So yes, there's a lot of limitations, but maybe as a snapshot, this is a good starting point. And the surprise here is you find in the high column, the high mortality column, basically US, Europe, and South America. As well as at the bottom, South Africa. And so that was not supposed to happen that way, right? The US, UK, EU were not supposed to be the countries most hit in terms of mortality by that first section of the pandemic, particularly the UK and the US being on the very top, right? So you see those numbers extremely high. They go from 2,500 here to 700. Germany being the better one here among the big Europeans. In the medium section, we have Israel, Canada. The world average is here. And then for the US, we still have one state that was doing middle. That's Hawaii. My province, BC, was in the same level. And then we find cases like Northern European cases. Finland, Iceland, Norway is about the same level. Right in between Finland and Iceland. And those 3 here, the 3 Nordics, who are the best performance in Europe, are much better than Sweden. And that matters because Sweden took a very, very different approach to the pandemic. So we see a very different result at that point. And then we find India and Indonesia. So for East Asia, Indonesia and the Philippines were the only cases in that medium category as of February. And then the low category, essentially, we find all of East Asia except Philippines and Indonesia. And that was still including Myanmar at the time. That's before just the data is essentially before the coup and all the chaos in the healthcare system. We find a few South Asian cases, Pakistan, Bangladesh, actually Bhutan is also very good. And then we find, Australia, New Zealand, and some African. Most of Africa is here. So in Africa, there's some undercounting, but by and large, there may still be some truth to it. The only African case that was really out of range was South Africa. It does happen to have the best healthcare system and the best measuring capacity, so maybe that shows there is undercounting, but there's still some interesting facts here. At the bottom, the best performers. So Tanzania is really, that's the official number at the time, but we know since then the president died of COVID after denying that there was COVID. And so everything we hear from Tanzania show that the numbers are higher. So if we don't count Tanzania, the best performers were Vietnam, Taiwan, Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, Thailand, Fiji, China. China, based on all the data we have in Wuhan in the early shock, the numbers, the real numbers may be at least 3 to 10 times higher. If it's 10 times higher, it would go here. If it's 30 times, if it's 3 times higher, it would be about 10. But here, if it's 10 times higher, it will be about here, like South Korea. So that hopefully we'll know in the future. But you find, most of East Asia, and then Japan is here in the upper section of that low group. So that's the data I use in the book. This is the update. So you find here the data I had in the book, and then this is the data as of yesterday. And here I first put the comparators, the global comparators outside East Asia. And they go from a max of almost 6,000 with Peru, Montenegro, Brazil, Italy, US, UK, they are the top, still the top, between 2,000 and 6,000. Most of Western Europe is here. Israel is actually gone up quite a lot, despite all the vaccination, to almost 900. Canada is at 700, close to world average, but above. And then you find still some, good performers in Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. Bhutan is incredibly good. And Bangladesh is good. Maldives here, quite good, below world average. So those are the comparators. So going from 6,000 to 4, with an average in the world at 600. And now Asia. So the surprise of the rankings as of right now, yesterday, is that Malaysia came on top. So Malaysia had a complete meltdown in July and August. And so became worse even per capita than Indonesia and the Philippines. And so that was partly a governance meltdown. There was, as we know, the government fell and everything, protests and the like. Indonesia and Philippines remained high, but did not have a political meltdown. So they kept going in the same direction. Mongolia, which did great in 2020, suddenly was overwhelmed. And so cases have been increasing very fast, and it's still high cases right now. The numbers is only 362, but Myanmar had a big crisis in July, but then it seems to taper off right now. I just had interviews yesterday with people based in Myanmar. The numbers look credibly better right now. Thailand has its own crisis, partly a political crisis again. Right now, it's returning to a better trend. Vietnam, that was the great surprise, with one of the best performers of 2020, was hit by Delta in the south around Ho Chi Minh City. And the contact tracing method without enough vaccination proved insufficient. Very hard to stop if you don't shut down your economy, your trade, and your tourism. And in Vietnam's case, there's a lot of supply chains and trade relationships. Japan has gone up, but not at terrible high speed, sort of in the same position that it was. Cambodia had a bit of a big burst, but seems to be back under control now. Brunei had a burst, but within boundaries. Korea increased, but always kept control. Very steady in Korea. Australia had also a big increase, but we're getting back under control. Taiwan had a burst in May, June, and then managed to stop it by August. So the numbers remain low, but it was still a blow when the burst happened in the big surge in May and June. Hong Kong, steady. Singapore, amazing. Some of the best numbers. New Zealand shut down. They closed their country. It's still closed, right? Nobody's going to New Zealand, but they have great numbers. China, no change. Extremely intense zero COVID policies. The borders are closed, etc. So similar. And then Laos, good numbers. I just don't know how reliable they are. So this is the data as of today. And so here a question for those of you who know better than me. There is this other data set based on excess mortality by IHME. And they have identified countries, when they published initially in the spring, countries that had a pretty big gap between excess mortality and COVID recorded mortality. One of those countries was Japan. And the ratio seems to be 1 to 10, a factor of 10. So I have not used it myself in the book. I wanted to hear from specialists in Japan whether that was credible. But here you got the graph with the different data sets on mortality, including the IHME work here, compared to the mortality recorded with the Johns Hopkins data. You can have all kind of other graphs. And those are more, those are other graphs that they have published in that team in the US with different scenarios based on uncertainty, but all higher than the recorded data for the spring, we're back to normal now. The factor is back to 1 right now. So there's no more excess mortality as we speak, according to that data set. For cases, their model seems to show actually less cases now than are recorded, at least in the summer, by the Johns Hopkins data. So I'm not a health specialist. I wanted to put here in case someone here in the audience has an idea of what's going on, and love to know how to address this data set that I have discovered here. So those are the current cases. This is the 7-day rolling average where it's still high. And you can see that India, for example, back in control. Japan, is really back now. Korea, even France, Germany, vaccines are working. Vietnam is coming down quickly. Canada, Europe in general. But where we have high cases, Montenegro, Mongolia, UK, US, despite vaccines, Malaysia is still on the high side. So this is where we are. But you can also see the volatility of those bursts, of those surges, showing the complexity of managing COVID, right? Let's keep that. So the big puzzle, which was really a motivation for my book, is we all know that there was this amazing index created by Johns Hopkins along with the Economist Intelligence Unit just in November 2019, the Global Health Security Index that incorporated everything. And it was telling us which countries would be better at handling a pandemic. And on top was the US, followed by UK, followed by Australia, Netherlands, Canada. Thailand was high, remarkably high here. Japan, where is Japan here? Japan is here on the high side, but just 1 notch lower, actually lower than Thailand, interestingly enough. So that was their index. And China was lower, India was lower here, right? And then I've tabulated those things based on my category, low, medium, high, in terms of mortality. That's as of February. And then the GHS index, high, medium, low capacity. So then you can say who is the expected high performer. So Thailand, Korea, Malaysia, Japan, Australia. That's because, as you remember, Japan is still in my low mortality category as of January. You have super achievers, those who did great despite a weak health capacity. That's Mongolia, Vietnam, China after January 23rd, not before, of course. Nigeria, Cuba, Ethiopia, Senegal, Uruguay, Myanmar, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And then the super underperformers, Switzerland, Sweden, France, US, UK, Spain. And then some other underperformers that include Italy, Brazil, some reasonable overperformers as of February, right? And then some underperformers here, Germany, Canada. So this is an interesting way you can compare what we expected based on the data we have and what happened. And to sell the kind of outcome, the big story here is, I think, when we do research in public policy and health policy, we underestimate how much politics can mess up everything. And in the case of the US, politics messed up the capacity that the institutions had to deal with it. And so, as we know, the CDC had been gutted, the coordination unit under the White House, the National Security Council, had been disbanded under the Trump administration. And so capacity had been gutted. And that was the result of politics, not raw capacity, right? And that's very hard to predict. Very, very hard to predict those things ahead of time. And all right, so I've seen, great, I got your message, Hiromi-san. So what were the factors? In this book, I argue that number one was institutional readiness, particularly the pre-existing centralized governance structure. So that's what matters, not just the healthcare system. It's an institution that's one level below the political regime. It can be in a democracy or in an autocracy, cuts across regime types, and it's above the healthcare system. What matters is the capacity to coordinate everything under crisis, this emergency capacity. And I'll give more details in the next slide. The second factor I find, based on case studies and correlation, is social cohesion. And so social trust, social cohesion, the ability of citizens to act for other citizens in their society, that becomes very, very important. That's why people wear masks or accept vaccines, right? And when we look at surveys on social cohesion and social trust, before the pandemic, we always find that East Asian cases, especially China, Singapore, Indonesia, are on the top, along with India, New Zealand, Australia, and the Nordic countries. Those were always the top in social cohesion. And there's a pretty good correlation with outcomes. So this is the punchline. The specific factors I identify is number one, the advanced institutional capacity, including general healthcare coverage, and pre-existing legal capacity for pandemic emergencies. For example, Taiwan had passed a whole bunch of laws up until 2019, just in case, right? That allowed to trigger the formation of a high-power committee that could order ministers. And that committee was immediately triggered on January 20. And for example, Japan did not have that capacity. There was not even the law for emergency, and that law had to be passed in March 1st, right? So Korea, Singapore, Thailand were very good with those things. That capacity to respond fast and coordinate everything. Second was the task force that were created in a centralized way. And that we're able to then deal with testing capacity, quarantine, border controls, isolation measures, and socioeconomic measures. In Japan, the blueprint was presented to the cabinet January 30th, but only implemented March 23rd after a new law was passed. All the other East Asian cases I mentioned had this working at the end of January. Third is the reliance on health scientists in key government positions. In the case of Taiwan, the vice president was a famous epidemiologist trained at Cornell, right? The empowerment of national CDC and the lack of politicization among parties. So we find this in almost all of East Asia, but not as much in Japan, where there was great competition between prime minister and governor of Tokyo. Fourth was the use of quarantine isolation measures and rapid border controls, not in Korea as much and late in Japan, but for most other East Asian cases, yes. Fifth, rapid provision of tests, very rapid testing, systematic use in the population. Very good in Korea, very good in Taiwan, very good in Singapore, slower in Japan, much slower. Six, reliance on universal mask wearing and adherence to social distancing measure. For that, Japan was great. In a way, the Japan story is the government did not act as rapidly and intensely as Singapore, Taiwan, or Korea, but the people, in a way, carried a lot of the burden, right, with the 3 C's and the mask wearing and the distancing and the hygiene. And that's, in a way, why Aso-san said Mindo was very high in Japan, right? 7, use of innovative contact tracing apps. That's very controversial, as we know, because of privacy concerns, but it was powerful and very effective in China, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Vietnam slower, of course, and a bit later, but there was an interesting innovation here. And then finally, precise, science-based, empowering communication from leaders to citizens. The best here were Prime Minister Ardern of New Zealand and Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in Singapore, as well as in Korea, actually, between President Moon and then the head of CDC, who was really very effective. So this is the institutional part. I tried to tabulate. Those are very hard to do, but this is interesting. When the headquarter task force was created, never happened in the US and UK, but China, January 25, Japan, March 23rd, Korea, 122, Mongolia, 119, Taiwan, 120, Indonesia later, Malaysia, February, Myanmar, March here, Philippines, March, Singapore, 122, Vietnam, 130, New Zealand, 128. And those, by the way, were things recommended by WHO and I believe the ADB and JICA as well. But not followed as effectively in Japan, and of course not in Western countries. Support for government, for quarantine, support for health, scientifically based decision making, those kind of things are all criteria as well that were interesting. So I was tracking those things to measure. The WF September 9, 2020 was praising Thailand, Italy, Mongolia, Mauritius, Uruguay, Pakistan, and Vietnam for doing better than their own healthcare capacity, basically due to good organization. Social cohesion. So this is before the pandemic. This is the 2017-2020 data from the World Value Survey. I pick here trust your neighborhood question. And the ranking is Vietnam on top, Iceland, Finland, Norway, very high, Thailand. UK here is high, interestingly. China, Canada, Germany, Australia, Taiwan, South Korea. Japan is lower. But those questions, are always difficult to compare because in Japan, there is always the translation issue and the expressiveness issue. So if you ask that question bluntly in Japan, some people may not respond as bluntly as they would, as what they meant, right? Pew survey after COVID shows that, when asked who is more divided, more united, you find in Asia in general, the society comes out more united, except in South Korea and Japan, very interestingly. But for the data they have here, we find a society coming out more unified. In Europe and US, we find much more division. US, 88% say we're more divided out of this. So that's exposed. Confidence in government, that's vertical trust. If you rank countries before based on what value survey, find China, Vietnam, of course, those are not completely free public opinion surveys, but this is what we get. Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand. So East Asia, very high. Canada in the middle, Germany still good. Finland and Japan is lower than the rest of Asia, but not the bottom. US is much lower, and then France, UK, Australia is surprisingly low here. This is exposed by Pew survey in June. Who did well? And you find Canada is okay, but in the US, most people are critical. And in Asia, very positive view, except in Japan, very critical view of the government. The rest of Asia, very positive view of what was done by their countries. And those are the drops over time. So you find some drop in Japan and Korea. So Korea is an interesting case because they did competently, but the public is not happy with it. In Japan, the numbers are less good, but the public is most mad. This is whether there should have been more restrictions by the government. Oh, Japan on top, 62% think there should be much more action by the government. That basically the government left the burden to the people, to society, rather than do stuff. Whereas Taiwan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, people are happy here. South Korea in the middle. And then on the healthcare system, however, there is trust in Japan, right? So this is positive. But in general, the numbers are quite positive across the board. All right, and then assessment of own response, you see in Japan, it went worse and worse, the negatives. But in Korea, it's still positive, but going down. Delta shock, today we're mostly dealing with Delta everywhere, except in South America and Philippines, interestingly enough. And what I have argued in my recent article is, this has been a big shock on the East Asian model. There's been fragmentation into 5 groups. It's beyond my book because based on what they can do. In some, they still do COVID-19 elimination strategy. That's Australia, China, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Taiwan. Vietnam is trying, but was pushed around. May get back under control, but there was a shock. Second group with South Korea and Singapore, soon Australia moving this way. Aggressive containment, strategic adaptation, and targeting opening based on high vaccination. Japan's third approach with low government controls, limited contact tracing, high reliance on voluntary social restrictions, and strong healthcare systems in the back, of course. So special. Fourth group is overwhelmed containment in South Asia, and another group is some reversal, but less. Oh, sorry, I put the same here. Sorry about that. I meant to say Philippines, Indonesia, not a full collapse, but numbers that are not very good. But the regressions for Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, Mongolia. This is Thailand. Vaccinations much lower in Asia. So now Japan is coming up, however, with 56%. Korea is coming up. Singapore is among the top right now. But the puzzle really is, why was the start so slow in Asia? And why, particularly, why Korea and Japan, with their strong biotech and pharmaceutical industry, were not able to develop a vaccine? That's one of the puzzles. If you know, I would love to know more about this. It's for future research. But so as a result, we basically rely worldwide on China, COVAX, US, EU, and Britain for production. That's the actual production. There's no production in Asia except China. And that's a surprise, but we have had bottlenecks. And so those are the evaluations of the different, but I'll skip that. The numbers in Asia today, full vaccination, 77 in China, in Singapore, 17 in China. Mongolia, Cambodia, surprising. Japan is here at 58. But, you know, Taiwan is very low, Vietnam is very low, Thailand is still low, and Korea is still surprisingly low and was low, basically. So I'll skip this here. So conclusion, COVID-19 has been a game changer because of the timing. It was a perfect storm, a crisis of global cooperation, had differential effects domestically and globally. It was a multifaceted crisis, and interestingly enough, East Asian and Oceanian countries performed better in 2020 due to institutional preparation and social cohesion. But Delta and the lengths of the crisis, the economic shock, social cost, etc., have proved very hard for some of the East Asian cases that have been forced to, you know, basically to lose some control with Delta. Big lesson, we have to have innovative leadership, need to learn a lot and rebuild the global cooperation and global institutional order. Thank you. Sorry for being over time.
Thank you very much. Very, very informative presentation. We wanted to hear more, but because of the limit of time, we have to stop. But let me ask first question. And, you know, you talked about the resilience or the, you know, responsiveness of the government, you know, especially capability to having maybe legal framework and so on. For instance, Taiwan that you mentioned, that Taiwan immediately, you know, get the legal capability. But if you look at Japan, Japan is, as you mentioned, it's a little slow and it was a little irresponsive. So from your, you know, study of the comparative, you know, the COVID-19 responses, would Japan be able to respond to the future health crisis? It seems like, you know, Taiwan, because they had the SARS and, you know, all the experience before that, they immediately came to the, you know, the mindset that we have to do something. But I think, as you said, the leadership, innovative leadership and the responsiveness or understanding the crisis, maybe not so much in Japanese leadership. That's my concern. And what is your view about that?
Yeah. So to some extent, it echoes the Kobe earthquake crisis of 1995, where, you know, it was a crisis of coordination, right? The coordination of all the resources and all level of governments was very slow and was difficult. There was better response in 2011 because some of those problems were fixed over time, except for the nuclear crisis, but for at least the earthquake and tsunami part. So in Japan, there's always learning, but essentially Japan yet doesn't have all the legal tools in place for dealing with a crisis like this at the speed that's required. Essentially, Japan doesn't yet have a law that creates a powerful central headquarter, like there's a National Security Council. There has to be a National Pandemic Council that can be triggered instantly and that has sweeping capacities to coordinate all the resources. And then there has to be sharing of data, right? In Taiwan, they were able to share data between the immigration at the border and the healthcare system. So if someone showed up in a healthcare clinic, the clinic knew if the person had traveled or not and had come back from abroad. You don't have things like this in Japan. That require legal tools, right? And you can't do it in the crisis. You have to do this before. And then, of course, with privacy guarantees, right? Taiwan does have solid privacy guarantees, and this is only for emergency periods. So it's a difficult balance, right? Getting the right capacity while protecting privacy. And then there's the question of contact tracing. Korea was remarkable, right? They were able to, without getting the authorization of people, but anyone who was COVID positive, the government could access their credit card records and their geolocation record and upload on their websites all the movements without the name. But on that basis, they could immediately inform everybody. That's very far-reaching in terms of privacy, and I know the public in Japan is not ready for that. but at least some discussion of what's possible based on the democratic values in Japan. But in Japan, the non-readiness is partly due to low trust in the government. So there has to be first some trusted component, like a super CDC with trusted healthcare professionals that can gain that trust before they can get more power. So there's interesting lessons looking at all those cases, what was done and what's possible. And then finally, there was, after that, it's an issue of leadership and within the cabinet, etc. And in Japan, there was early on an effort at coordinating economic social cost with health cost. And I guess, and many countries did that too. But the lesson here is that with COVID, you had to really be strong and fast on the healthcare side to be able to reopen the economy. And so the lesson in the end is those who acted fast also perform better on the economy. So we did not know that before. It was not a given, but that's the lesson. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. There was a hand raised by Izumi-san. Do you want to ask a question directly? Izumi-san, are you there? Maybe not. Okay. Okay, so we have one question from the audience. It's a question by Abe-san. He asked, initially WHO leadership was criticized, but now major Western countries are supporting continued leadership. Why? Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, so, well, we have to unpack both sides, right? So in general, the WHO is highly respected around the world, right? Because WHO over time did many, many things. During SARS-1, they were slow, etc. But the leader of WHO, Brundtland, Miss Brundtland, was actually pretty effective. She banged the table, telling China was not forthcoming its data. In the end, she played a positive role in this. And then after that, there were new guidelines, health guidelines that were passed. And then, of course, they were very helpful for Ebola, for many things. And in general, over time, many countries have built trust with WHO. In this particular case, there was a major problem, right? In fact, there were two major problems. The major problems are China and US. On the Chinese side, initially the data was not fast coming out of China. There was even technical delay in triggering, according to the international health regulations, once the WHO put a query to China, and that query happened on the 30th, the country where there's a pandemic must respond within 24 hours. The formal response came on January 3rd, so there was like a 4-day delay. And so that's not WHO's problem, in a way. It was a big country problem. Next, WHO is criticized because the January 22nd committee meeting did not result in calling an emergency, well, it's not yet a pandemic, but an alert of interest, or a pandemic of high interest. And that's because we know the committee was divided. It's not just that China was probably arguing not to do it, but it was not just China. Apparently, it was a full division in the committee because data was not complete. But that's a mistake. We know with hindsight. I tend to believe that this was less political. It was more like peer review process. It's a committee full of scientists and healthcare professionals. And normally people don't want to call an alert, as they did, for example, with H1N1 too fast. They want data first. I think that explains part of what happened. But of course, he was perceived by the US and others as being pushed by China. And then they called the alert on the 29th of January. So we have to go back and revisit this. Ideally, WHO should have called the alert faster and earlier. So then you have to revamp those committees to be more like a rapid reaction force, right? Something that's very active. Because many healthcare professionals like Dr. Hosterholm in the US and people in Taiwan, on some doctors in Taiwan that advised the Taiwan CDC, they had a visit to China in Wuhan in January 13. And they were hosted by the hospitals. And the Chinese CDC and the hospitals told the Taiwanese that there was human-to-human transmission. That was a full week before China said it officially. But Taiwan got that info. On that info, Taiwan then triggered, they had a meeting on the 15th, and then they triggered all the pandemic reaction. And so, that was known outside, everyone could see what Taiwan is doing. And yet the rest of the world did not act, and WHO either, right? So with hindsight, that those critical few days, that's a criticism. Beyond that, the WHO then was doing what it can. But if you have the two major powers not cooperating, US and China, it's very hard, right? WHO can bang the table and say, we want access, and China says no, then you have to negotiate, because that's what you're stuck, right? And if the US meanwhile pulls out the funding, it's also a problem. So it's, the world has to be more reasonable and really strengthen something like WHO and fix the problems and give them more space, right? The world needs the WHO.
Okay, thank you. So Izumi-san, would you like to ask a question? No? Okay. So Kurokawa Sensei, are you there? We have Professor Kurokawa, who is already on the screen, but I hope he can talk. Yes. Do you have a video on?
Thank you for your presentation. I went through your paper in the Cambridge thing, and I think I was also mystified in the different countries. And I know certain weaknesses in the Japan government, because I was really pushing Ministry of Health to have more PCR earlier. But they really limited this examination because they just use a pre-existing policy, so that you had to call up the health officers and ask them to do PCR. But PCR equipment are pretty much everywhere in the university. Why they are not doing this kind of thing was my complaint, but I think they stuck with their own thing. And so that was the reason I think Japan's initial response was not quite appropriate. And I think it reminded me of the 10 years ago of Fukushima accident, the same thing. Because I argue, Japanese bureaucrats working very hard and smart, but when the things are not visible, unexpected, like radioactivity or virus, their brain are stuck and not functioning. That's my sort of teasing comments to them. So I read your thing, and now you updated all the data again, more detailed, and I really like to see this thing. Maybe if you don't mind it, maybe I'm sure you're writing something, and it still continues as a global pandemic once in a century. And so I think in this connected world, transparency is a key to work together. And otherwise, I think we may lose some and we may win some, but this is a pandemic of once in a century. So I think openness and transparency is a key. That's my argument within this government. I'm pushing them to do that, but I think all the political processes are a bit different. So I think I'm wondering whether I think I could share some of your data, because you are really updating and analyzing all the things, which is great. And I think that become one of the great resources, particularly to WHO and elsewhere too. So I'd like to get back to you, and I think continue a dialogue to make some use to certain government people and some decision makers. That was my impression.
Thank you, Kurokawa Sensei. I'm very happy to share the PowerPoint, and I would be very happy to publish together with GRIPS and with you. Yeah, very happy to. I totally agree with you, and I love this point on transparency. We're in this together, right?
Right, because I'm pushing this in this hyper-connected world. Whatever you do, transparency is the foundation of trust, as an individual or as an institution, as a nation. And you used to, I think, work at GRIPS and with a few Takenaka-san and some other political scientists. So So I think this is a great opportunity to develop some of the things through GRIPS with you and UBC.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Great.
you mentioned Takenaka-san, right? He was
Right.
he hosted me before in the past at GRIPS because he's
Why don't we try to do that? Yeah, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there are a couple questions. I don't know. Do you have still a time to answer questions, or
Oh
do
yeah,
you...
very happy to. Yeah,
Okay, good.
Evening
So,
here, no other meetings. So
okay, so let me address some of the questions which is in the Q&A box. First one is from Daniela. In terms of policy innovations, how did non-government actors or public-private partnership do? Can we say the role of such actor is growing?
we can always say that, yeah, because that's a general principle across the board. We have more and more private and NGO actors, and the partnerships are growing. Then it's case by case, right? In every country, we have seen all kind of interesting things going on. We have seen, there are many stories of NGOs acting in many countries, or and actually also some groups sometimes acting against some private or social actors acting against the coordination. So that's a good point in general, that getting down to the level of the most significant kind of social economic actors and the kind of partnership, that'd be a great study actually to do across comparatively and doing typologies and the like. Yeah, I mean, we also have a lot of action by subnational governments, cities, so in Japan, we know cities and prefectures and have taken many actions. Of course, healthcare professionals, hospitals, universities, so academics, yeah, so there's so much more to study. This is true that this book just scratches the surface by focusing on the policy at a higher level. Mm-hmm.
Great, so another question here is regarding with the COVID-19 and public financing, there is a criticism against disclosure of contracts between companies and COVAX, CEPI and Gavi, and information of public funding in the decision-making on access to vaccines and pricing. How do you think that we can ensure transparency and accountability of the system?
I'm less worried about COVAX and Gavi because, in a way, I don't think there's huge price differentials. Their model is, COVAX is you get the developed countries to pay, and the developing countries, the poorer countries, to get the vaccine access for free. But the problem has not been so much the money, it's been the lack of supply, because there's not enough supply that goes into the COVAX. That's why you're still at 2% in many African countries. The bigger problem here is more the vaccine contracts that were signed between countries and the private companies, like Pfizer and Moderna and the like. There was a bidding war, and we know very little yet. But we have heard things, newspapers have published data showing that the range of prices paid, for example, for Pfizer vaccines may have gone between $15 to $50 for developed countries. And countries that could pay higher, like $50 a dose, got it first. So in the early months, this bidding war had a huge impact on access. And it continues, right? To some extent. Some countries now in Asia have been very fast. That includes Japan, and probably they paid more than other countries because Japan was a slow mover initially. But then when it finally approved, which was slow, approval came late in the spring, then we had a very energetic vaccine minister, and we had the Tokyo Olympics, and we had the push from the prime minister. And at that point, I'm pretty sure Japan signed very aggressive contracts, which we will know only later. Other countries, who didn't want to pay as much, they offered access to data. And some countries did both, right? So the fastest country we know is Israel. They offered to Pfizer both access to the data and high price. A country like Canada was less access and lower price. So initially we had no vaccine for a while. And yet Canada apparently was possibly the third most rapid country in booking and ordering vaccines across the board from many big, but not willing to pay as high and to give full disclosure of data because of privacy concerns. Of course, Canada has to grapple with the US embargo. So what really delayed us in Canada was US had an embargo on exporting any vaccine from Moderna and Pfizer made in the US to anywhere, including Canada, part of USMCA, until end of May, right? Until end of May, every dose made in the US stayed in the US. And so we got our early vaccines from Europe, but we got less than many others. So there was some delay. Yeah, so there is a lot to learn from those contracts. Hopefully we can do better in the future to have more fairness and more, we should have a system that allows to vaccinate all healthcare systems first around the world.
Okay, so the question is that I think audience are really impressed with the use of parameter that which not so many people used before. So would you think there'll be added some new parameters to evaluate countries' readiness against the pandemic after experiencing this pandemic?
Yes, I would believe so, right? Because that's how we learn in science, right? We there's the first batch, there's the 2019 the Global Health Security Index, which was based on reasonable things, right? And then we find out that, first of all, it underplayed politics, and second of all, it underplayed in the intermediary institutions, like those legal tools, those coordination tools, and those kind of things. And then social cohesion is another matter. So yeah, I believe we're gonna update, learn, and there'll be good sharing. By the way, Japan is fascinating because Japan may have been slow at home, but Japan played a role in helping other countries beforehand in building those good institutions. And again, I want to give kudos to JICA, to ADB, WHO, has many Japanese and many doctors from Japan, etc., have worked in the rest of Asia, Southeast Asia especially. I know in Vietnam, in Thailand, etc., and played a key role in building those tools, right? But those tools could not be built similarly in Japan. So there's some irony here.
Okay, maybe final question here. You talked about the failure of global governance, and despite the lack of global governance, I think a lot of national government try to do their best. So the question is, they have been intervened by international politics, and there is no viable international corporation health. How do you think that we should create it better?
It's a good one. So it's not just health, right? I treat this health because everything interacts so much. So there's health, there's economy, and then there's other stuff, security. So all those pieces have to be managed at the same time. But on the health side, right now we have nothing but WHO of a significant, of the scale. So all the efforts have to be on WHO. And there are proposals out there. Again, I would give a shout to Dr. Osterholm, who is actually part of the advisory team, President Biden, the head of the center at Minnesota, but many others, even Bill Gates wrote about this. There are many interesting books that had written about those things before. And I think we need to review the decision-making in the peak committee of WHO. We need a revised international health regulation agreements to ensure faster flow of information, and but you cannot have this until the tensions between US and China go down. Because if everybody goes and scream at China, say, you must extend more information, they won't do it. I mean, that's not how you get cooperation, right? And there's no way we get cooperation by screaming at each other. There has to be a sense of mutual trust, right? And so that's the major problem today. And then so US-China thing is an issue. And then we need to augment the capacity, the budget. Then we need a rapid reaction force. There should be a bunch of doctors and specialists that are able to fly very quickly to any place, and then to be able to investigate a new pandemic as it happens, and it should be trusted by everybody. And And then there has to be a one health concept, a one world health concept where we combine. So apparently there is not enough research on the reservoirs of COVID among bats. There is not enough research of this, right? Maybe we have to watch the gain of function research. That's, we find out, risky. So there's concerns about that. And it's very hard to keep any lab of the level 4 safe. In fact, there were many safety issues as well in the US, many warnings. So that is a concern. But however, we need to somehow have an inventory of the amount of viruses out there among bats and to be able to be better equipped. And then we have to protect some of the reservoirs. And then we have to do better with farming, industrial farming, because otherwise the flu will hit us. Unless the mRNA vaccine can save us and have a universal flu vaccine, but we don't have that yet. So all this should be done together with better cooperation. On the economic side, we need to go back to the spirit of 2008, right? There should have been a big G20, and there should have been much more money unlocked from the IMF to help the poor countries to do social protection and all. So we had an increase in poverty of 100 million people. We had, it's like all kinds of things that could have been prevented. Otherwise, conflicts will come out of this. There will be deep pain and legacy out of this. So that's on the economy side.
Great, thank you so much. I think we went so much of your time, and I think we have, very good discussion so far. And I want to thank Professor Yves Tiberghien and for a very, very comprehensive talk and all the question and answers. Thank you very much. And we'll keep in touch. And the video will be uploaded on our website. Thank you very much to everyone who joining us for today's discussion. Thank you.
Very happy to cooperate on any of this.
Thank you. We'll have maybe collaboration in the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございます。
どうもありがとうございました。